Welcome to the sanctuary of my sun porch. It's good to be with you again this morning. My sermon title is 8 Talents, 1 Story, Multitudinous Meanings. Over his 3-year ministry, Jesus told a total of 31 parables to get his messages across. Although the parable of the talents is the longest in the book of Matthew, it's really only around 390 words, give or take a few, depending upon which translation we use. Yet, as is true of every parable, this is not a story with a clear take-home message. It provides us with a lot of material to ponder, probably enough to provide a lifetime of study. Parables are stories with layers of meaning. They come with a warning, though. If you believe that you know the meaning of a parable, you can pretty much be sure that you're mistaken. So this morning, I'm going to present to you 6 different layers of meaning to ponder. If you skipped reading the parable of Matthew, please put me on pause or stop reading the sermon and read the gospel lesson. If you've already read it, you may want to read it again. Now, before delving into the layers, I want to talk a little about talents. In biblical times, a talent was a unit of weight which varied by time and location. A talent of silver could be in the neighborhood of 75 pounds and could be about 6,000 denarii coins, or about 20 years of wages for a common laborer. It's difficult to translate monetary values not only from one culture to another, but also over a period of 2,000 years. Yet it's quite possible that a talent might be worth as much as $500,000 in today's economy. Perhaps even more. It may be a little on the high side, but American theologian Donald Hagner has estimated a talent to be worth $1 million. This may put a slightly different spin on how you understand the parable. Also of note is the fact that in this and most of the interpretations I'm presenting, Jesus is understood to be the master. Layer 1. One interpretation, particularly favored by television evangelists, revolves around the idea of the management of money and how to increase it. Many churches use this parable on Stewardship Sunday, and certainly it does have good things to say about being rewarded for investing our money and about all of the positives and about the positive side of risk-taking, something that really scares the endowment trustees. But when you think about the talents in context, that interpretation doesn't stand up. The parable is a part of what's known as the Olivet Discourse, or the Olivet Prophecy, because it was told to the disciples on the Mount of Olives. The discourse contains 3 parables: the wise and foolish virgins, the talents, and the sheep and the goats. Contextually, these parables were sandwiched in between the prophecy of the destruction of the temple and signs of the end times and the passion of Jesus. Perhaps we can safely assume that the parable doesn't really have a lot to do with money, investing, or risk-taking, since that would be of little matter in light of the impending passion of Jesus and the prophecy of the events leading up to the second coming. Layer 2. The English word talent, meaning a natural ability, comes from the symbolism in this parable. We may not be able to sing or dance or paint or excel in sports, for example, but we all possess God-given gifts. The way we use these gifts is important because, like the money entrusted to the servants, the gifts we've received are not ours alone. God gave them to us for the purpose of serving God and other people. Our particular gifts may seem quite middling, but God expects us to use them to the best of our ability, sort of like turning lemons into lemonade. Like the master in the parable, Jesus has left us and entrusted us, his work to us. And also like the master in the parable, he will return someday to judge how well we've performed our duties. Biblical scholar and theologian Richard Bauckham has written, "What God has given us, ourselves, our lives, our faith, our abilities, our gifts, our possessions, is given in order to be spent and put into circulation, in order to be the source of further blessings for others and for ourselves." This is probably the most widely used interpretation. Layer 3. This interpretation looks at the parable almost as some kind of corporate experiment, where the master or manager is trying to discover the loyalty and worth of his slaves or employees. One of the best ways to do this is to give them tasks, leave them to their own devices, and see how well they perform. Well, as we know, the first 2 slaves did very well indeed. According to the calculations I spoke about, the first might have returned with as much as 10 million talents. The second with 4 million. Both were invited into the joy of the master. Not for the amount of money they made, but because they set to work immediately doing the work of the master. And then we have the third slave, called lazy, idle, wicked, slothful, certainly not worthy of the manager's time. He would never be invited into the joy of the master, which equates with moving up the corporate ladder. He would be fired or cast into the unemployment office. Layer 4. In looking at the third servant who buried the money, some interpretations equate this act with burying our faith, our relationship with God, or the gospel itself. Or maybe we hide it away in a closet to be taken out on Sundays, instead of allowing it to transform us by responding every day to God's call. Layer 5. For this layer, we take a closer look at the third slave. Depending upon which translation of the Bible we use, he's called lazy, evil, slothful, wicked, untrustworthy, etc., because he buried the 1 talent given to him by his master. But, and this is a big but, if you really think about it, because it's a big but, because if you really think about it, burying 75 pounds of silver coins was not an effortless task. First, he had to find a safe place to bury the coins. Then he had to dig a hole large enough to hold the coins and deep enough not to be noticed. Then he had to pack up the coins in something that wouldn't decay. He couldn't just use a sack. Then he had to get the coins to the hole and bury it. And he had to do all of that without anyone noticing. I'd be willing to bet quite a few denarii that this slave put a lot more effort into the assignment than either of the other slaves. My goodness, it would have simply been easier for him to simply haul the talents to the bankers than it was to bury it. Then, despite already being seen as a failure, the slave is emboldened to call his master a crook. "Master, I know that you are a harsh man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you did not scatter seed." Does the master cast the slave out because he didn't make a profit? Or was it because he called him a crook? Or was it both? Notice that the master doesn't dispute what the slave has said. The parable doesn't really tell us any of this. In interpreting this action, it might speak volumes concerning the condition of the slave's heart toward his master. Or it may say something entirely different, which leads us to the final interpretation, layer 6. In the newest interpretation, theologians Richard Rohrbaugh and William R. Herzog developed the idea separately as of seeing the parable as a social critique. As such, it's been embraced by many as a part of liberation theology. I find it fascinating. The Western Church has typically interpreted the talents as being about proper investment. Jesus' disciples are urged to use their abilities and gifts to serve God without reservation, without fear of taking risks until his return. But Rabbah argues that the parable is all about exploitation. A modern Western audience would applaud the first two slaves for trading and investing well, but an ancient audience would have approved of the third slave's behavior and condemned that of the first two because they profited at the expense of others. Rabbah explains it like this: given the limited good outlook of ancient Mediterranean cultures, seeking more was considered morally wrong. Because the pie was limited and already distributed, anyone getting more meant someone else got less. Thus, honorable people did not try to get more, and those who did were automatically considered thieves. To have gained, to have accumulated more than one started with, is to have taken the share of someone else. This interpretation casts the actions of the first two slaves as shameful and the third slave as honorable. One must also assume that in this interpretation, the corrupt master is not Jesus. The scenario played out in the parable was not uncommon in the ancient world. Greedy people who did not want to get accused of profiting at the expense of others, which was considered shameful, would delegate their business to slaves who were held to a different standard. Rabbah explains this reasoning. Shameful, even greedy behavior could be condoned in slaves because slaves had no honor nor any expectation of it. Consequently, in the talents parable, the master leaves his money with his slaves in the hope that they will exploit the system for him and increase his riches. The first two slaves do just this, but the third honorably refrains from taking anything that belongs to the share of another. This slave also does not invest his money at the bank, through which he would have earned interest. The master reprimands the slave for not doing at least this much, but Rabbah points out seeking interest from another Israelite was forbidden by the Torah, and elsewhere in Luke, Jesus says that we should lend expecting nothing in return. According to Herzog, in today's thinking, the third servant is a whistleblower who has unmasked the joy of the master for what it is: the profits of exploitation squandered in wasteful excess. In a not unfamiliar scenario, the third servant is punished for speaking truth to power and for not failing to make a profit, From the critical perspective of liberation theology, the message of the parable of the talents is that we must act in solidarity with other people when confronting social, political, and economic injustices. So, should the actions of the third slave be condemned or praised? According to Rabbah, reading the parable with ancient eyes suggests that the third slave is the only one who behaved honorably. Now that I've unpacked 6 of the layers I was able to discern, I would imagine that you'd like me to tell you which one is right. But the beauty in a parable is that it can hold very different yet profound meanings for everyone. What's true for me may not be true for you. And I think you'll find that if you spend some time with the meaning you first glom onto, you'll eventually discover new meanings within it. Or you may come to the realization that you had it totally wrong. You will also come to a deeper appreciation of Jesus as storyteller. May we all be blessed with discernment in our search for deeper meaning. Amen. And I'll see you next month.